She arrived with a broken trunk, a cast-iron skillet, and nothing left to lose. And the men of Red Hollow Ranch laughed the moment they saw her. They said a widow with rough hands and worn boots had no business on a cattle ranch. They said Gideon Hale had finally lost his mind. They said she wouldn't last a week. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed standing in that cold Wyoming morning, was that Clara Mercer had already survived the worst thing a woman could lose. And she was done being afraid. If you've ever been counted out by people who didn't know your worth, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach dropped her off at the edge of a dirt road with no ceremony whatsoever. No station, no platform, just a weathered post with a faded sign that read Red Hollow, 3 miles nailed crookedly into the wood, and below it, someone had scratched in pencil what appeared to be an arrow pointing west. The driver didn't even climb down to help with the trunk. He just pushed it off the back with his boot and clicked his horse into motion before the dust had settled around Clara Mercer's feet. She stood there a moment, watching the coach disappear around the bend. The Wyoming wind cut straight through her coat. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, the kind of sky that promised nothing good. Clara reached down, grabbed the leather handle of the trunk with both hands, and started walking. The trunk was heavier than it looked. One of the hinges had broken somewhere between Cheyenne and here, and she'd tied a piece of rope around it to keep the lid from swinging open. Inside was everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, a wool blanket, her mother's sewing kit, a small stack of letters she hadn't been able to throw away, and a cast-iron skillet that weighed almost as much as the rest of it combined. Her sister had called her foolish for bringing the skillet. Leave it behind, Clara. Start fresh. But the skillet had been her grandmother's, and some things you carried not because they were practical, but because letting go of them felt like agreeing that nothing in your past had mattered. She'd left behind enough already. The walk took the better part of an hour. Her boots were not made for uneven ground, and by the time the ranch came into view, she had turned her ankle twice on loose stones and torn the hem of her coat on a fence post. The ranch itself appeared first as a cluster of dark shapes against the hills. A main house, a barn, several outbuildings, a long bunkhouse running parallel to a creek that looked nearly dry. Cattle moved in the far pasture, distant enough that they were just dark spots drifting against brown grass. It was not a beautiful place, exactly, but it was solid. That was the word that came to Clara as she crossed the final stretch of road and pushed open the gate. Solid. The fence posts were straight and properly set. The barn roof had been recently patched. The yard between the buildings was swept clean of debris, and the split-rail corral held 8 horses that looked well-fed and in good health. Whatever else this place was, it was run by someone who took care of things. That mattered to Clara more than beauty ever had. She knocked on the door of the main house. A long silence followed. Then heavy footsteps, uneven, one slightly heavier than the other, as if whoever was walking had once hurt that leg and never quite healed it straight. The door opened, and Clara got her first look at Gideon Hale. He was taller than she'd expected from the letter. Broad through the shoulders, with the kind of frame that suggested he'd been a bigger man once and had since been worn down some by weather and work and whatever else life had done to him. His hair was dark with a fair amount of silver threading through it, cut short and a little rough, like he'd done it himself without a mirror. There was a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye toward his jaw, pale and old, long-healed. His eyes were dark brown, cautious, and at the moment he opened the door, they moved across Clara with the flat assessment of someone who spent more time judging livestock than people. She looked back at him with the same frankness. "You're the widow from Harlow County," he said. It wasn't a question. "Clara Mercer," she said. "You're Gideon Hale." He looked past her at the trunk sitting in the dirt. "You walked from the post road." The driver didn't stop. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite sympathy, but perhaps acknowledgement that this was not ideal. He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The kitchen was large and functional, with a long table, a wide iron stove, and a shelf running the full length of the east wall stacked with canned goods, dried beans, and enough flour to feed a small army. It smelled of wood smoke and old grease, and faintly of coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long. On the table lay a tally book, a pencil, and a half-eaten biscuit that had clearly been that morning's breakfast and nothing since. Gideon gestured to a chair. Clara sat. He remained standing, which told her something about how he handled himself. He was a man who didn't sit down until he'd decided the situation warranted it. "The position is cook and housekeeper," he said. "Breakfast before sunup, dinner at noon, supper after sundown. 12 ranch hands plus myself. You'll have full use of the kitchen and root cellar. Room and board plus wages, same as I told you in the letter." "That's acceptable," Clara said. "It's physical work. Long hours. I understand what a ranch kitchen is." He studied her again, not unkindly, but with the same careful measuring he'd applied the moment the door opened. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 38. I know. He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "Most women who take positions like this out here are either older or more—" He seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. "Never mind. Do you need anything before I show you the kitchen properly?" "My trunk needs to come in out of the dirt," Clara said. "And I'd appreciate a cup of coffee if there's any left in that pot that isn't completely destroyed." Gideon almost smiled at that. Almost. He got the trunk himself, which she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, carried it through the door without comment, and set it in the hallway near the kitchen. Then he poured her a cup of coffee. It was, in fact, nearly destroyed, thick and bitter and overcooked, and poured one for himself and sat down across from her at the table. That was the first time he sat down. She met the ranch hands that evening at supper. There were 11 of them present. Gideon had mentioned one was out checking the eastern fence line and wouldn't return until morning. They came in from the yard in groups of 2 and 3, stomping mud off their boots at the door, hanging hats on the row of pegs by the wall, and taking their usual places at the long table with the unconscious habit of men who had eaten in the same seats for years. Clara had spent the afternoon learning the kitchen. She'd inventoried the root cellar, checked the smokehouse behind the house, gone through every shelf and drawer, and built a mental picture of what she had to work with. Then she'd cooked supper from what was available, a proper beef stew with potatoes and onions, cornbread made from scratch, and dried apple cake using the last of the dried apples in a tin on the top shelf that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. She served it without announcement. Just set the pot in the center of the table, the cornbread on a board, and the cake on a tin plate at the end, and stepped back. The first few minutes were quiet in the way that happens when hungry men discover the food is better than they expected. Then the talking started back up, and with it, the looking. They looked at her the way men look at something that doesn't quite fit where it's been placed. She was too clean for the kitchen, one of them seemed to decide. Or rather, not clean exactly, but careful, with straight posture and hands that moved with deliberate efficiency and a way of watching the room that struck several of them as unusual in a cook. She didn't keep her eyes down. She didn't bustle and apologize and fill the silences with cheerful noise. She just moved quietly through the room, refilled the coffee without being asked, and watched everything. The one who spoke first was a hand named Decker. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and sun-darkened, with a jaw that looked like it had been hit a few times and set crooked. He had the specific manner of a man who had always been the loudest person in whatever room he occupied. "You the new cook?" he said, though he clearly knew the answer. "I am," Clara said. "What happened to May?" "May left in September," said another hand, older, gray-bearded, who Clara would learn was called Stubbs, and who served as something between a senior hand and an unofficial conscience for the whole outfit. "You know that, Decker." "Just asking." Decker leaned back in his chair and looked at Clara with frank appraisal that was not particularly respectful. "You cook everything yourself, or you got help coming?" "Just me," Clara said. "Long days for one woman." "I've had long days before." He looked at her worn coat, which she hadn't yet changed out of, and at the rope still tied around her trunk visible through the kitchen doorway. Something like amusement crossed his face. "Where are you from?" "Harlow County." "Never heard of it." "Most people haven't." "What's there?" "Nothing much anymore," Clara said, and moved to refill the coffee at the far end of the table, putting the conversation behind her. But she felt Decker watching her for the rest of the meal. Not with hostility exactly, but with the specific interest of someone deciding whether a new arrival was worth bothering to figure out, or just worth making uncomfortable enough to leave. She'd dealt with men like Decker before. In fact, she'd dealt with worse. The first week was about learning the shape of things. Clara woke before 4 o'clock each morning, well before anyone else stirred, and had the stove hot and the first pots going by the time the sky started to lighten. She kept a small lamp on the counter and worked in the quiet for an hour or two before the boots started sounding on the bunkhouse steps. She liked that time. The kitchen was hers alone in those early hours, and she could think clearly without anyone watching her do it. She learned quickly. The root cellar had poor ventilation, and certain things kept better on the north-facing shelf. The stove burned hot on the left side and cooler on the right, which required compensation when baking. 3 of the hands didn't eat onions. Not an allergy, just preference, and she adjusted without making it into something. Stubbs drank his coffee with a lot of milk and took it as a personal small kindness when she had it ready. The hand named Tomas, who was the youngest and spoke little, had a habit of coming back to the kitchen around mid-afternoon when everyone else was out, not for food, but because the kitchen was warm and he seemed to find something reassuring about being near activity without having to participate in it. Clara let him sit without comment, and he always left before anyone else returned. By the end of the first week, the meals were noticeably better than anything the ranch had seen in months. Even Decker admitted it, though he did so sideways, saying he supposed he'd had worse biscuits somewhere and couldn't specifically remember where. Gideon said nothing about the food directly, but she noticed him eating more at each meal than he apparently had been, and the half-eaten biscuits on the table stopped appearing. He was a quiet man in the complicated way that quiet men sometimes are. Not shy, not reserved in a wounded sense, but someone who had at some point decided that most words were unnecessary and defaulted to silence unless the situation specifically required otherwise. He said what needed saying. He didn't say the rest. Clara found this easier to deal with than the alternative. She'd spent years living with a man who filled every silence with something that needed to be answered or managed, and there was a kind of rest in Gideon's particular quietness that she hadn't expected. Their conversations in those early days were mostly logistical. She'd tell him what supplies were running low and what she needed from town. He'd either arrange it or tell her when he was going in and could bring it back. They discussed whether the smokehouse had enough capacity for the next slaughter, and agreed it probably didn't. She pointed out that 2 of the shelves in the root cellar were rotting and would need replacement before the cold really set in. He came and looked, agreed, and sent Tomas to fix them the following morning. He listened when she spoke about practical things. That was more than she'd expected, and she tried not to make too much of it. What she hadn't expected was what happened in Garnet Creek. Garnet Creek was the nearest town, about 8 miles southwest, large enough to have a general store, a feed merchant, a post office, a bank, and a saloon that doubled as the primary social institution of the territory. Clara went in with Gideon the second Saturday after her arrival to pick up supplies. She sat in the wagon while he loaded feed and then walked with him into the general store. The store was run by a woman named Mrs. Polly Fitch, who was approximately 60 years old, round-faced, and possessed of the kind of sharp civic awareness that comes from a lifetime spent behind a counter where all the gossip in a 50-mile radius eventually arrived. She greeted Gideon with familiar ease, began pulling his usual order, and looked at Clara with a smile that was warm on the surface and measuring underneath. "This must be your new cook," she said to Gideon. "Clara Mercer," Clara said, and offered her hand. Mrs. Fitch shook it with the slightly exaggerated enthusiasm of someone performing friendliness. "Welcome to Garnet Creek, Mrs. Mercer. We don't get many new faces out here." "I can imagine," Clara said. "Gideon's been needing a good cook up at the ranch ever since May Tully moved on to her sister's place down in Colorado. Terrible business, that was. Not May leaving. I mean, that was her choice, but before that, the whole—" She stopped herself with the practiced precision of someone who knew exactly where to stop. "Well, you'll hear all about the territory soon enough." Clara filed this away. They were at the counter waiting for the order to be tallied when the shop door opened and a woman came in with the particular kind of entrance that suggested she was accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around her arrival. She was perhaps 50, dressed very well for a frontier town. A deep green coat, good gloves, hair arranged with deliberate elegance. She was handsome in a severe way, with high cheekbones and pale eyes, and the posture of someone who had never once stood unsure of her welcome. This was the first time Clara saw Evelyn Ashcroft. Evelyn's eyes moved across the room and found Gideon with the efficiency of a compass finding north. Then they moved to Clara. "Gideon," she said pleasantly, "I heard you'd hired someone new." Mrs. Ashcroft, Gideon said. News travels fast in Garnet Creek. She smiled at Clara. Evelyn Ashcroft. I have the Ashcroft Holdings, east of here. And you are? Clara Mercer, Clara said. I'm the cook at Red Hollow. Just the cook, Evelyn said, with exactly the kind of just that transforms a simple word into something else entirely. For now, Clara said. It was not a planned response. It came out before she'd decided to say it, and she wasn't entirely sure what she'd meant by it. But she saw something cross Evelyn Ashcroft's face, something quick and carefully controlled, before the smile returned. Well, Evelyn said, I hope you find Garnet Creek welcoming, Mrs. Mercer. We take care of our own out here. She let that sit for exactly a beat, and we're always careful about who becomes our own. She moved to the counter, exchanged a brief word with Mrs. Fitch about some shipment, and left. Gideon was quiet on the drive back to Red Hollow, the kind of quiet that meant he was thinking about something and hadn't decided yet whether to say it. Clara sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the road and didn't push. They were about a mile out from the ranch when he said, without looking at her, Evelyn Ashcroft has been trying to purchase my land for the last 4 years. I gathered she wasn't just being neighborly, Clara said. She's not. He paused. She's smart. And she doesn't lose gracefully. Clara looked at the road ahead. Neither do I, she said. Gideon didn't respond to that. But when they pulled into the yard and he climbed down to unhitch the horses, she thought she saw, again, almost a smile. By the 3rd week, something had changed in the bunkhouse. It happened gradually, without any single moment she could have pointed to. Decker still made remarks. He was constitutionally incapable of not making remarks, but the edge on them had softened somewhat. She'd overheard him telling one of the younger hands that the new cook was hard to rattle, which Clara suspected was high praise from Decker, though he'd deny it. Thomas had begun lingering in the kitchen for longer stretches, and one afternoon he'd asked her quietly if she could show him how to make cornbread. She'd shown him without making a fuss about it, and he'd produced a passable loaf on his first attempt, and stood looking at it with the particular pleasure of someone who has never been allowed to discover they're capable of something. Stubbs had started calling her Mrs. Mercer, which sounds like a small thing, but out here was not. Among the ranch hands there was a specific shorthand. You called men by their last name or a nickname, and you called women either by their first name or ma'am in a generic way. Using Mrs. Mercer was a choice. It meant something. She was not one of them yet. She understood she might never be, in the way that the first person to arrive in a new place is never quite the same as those who arrived before them. But she was becoming something. A fixture, perhaps. Someone the ranch began to arrange itself around without quite realizing it was doing so. The ranch hand's laundry started appearing outside the kitchen door, not because she'd offered to do it, but because someone had started bringing it and others had followed without discussion. She did it without comment. She'd done harder things without comment. The hardest thing had been leaving Harlow County. She didn't talk about Harlow County. Not with Gideon, not with the hands, not with Mrs. Fitch in the general store, who had asked with that particular kind of friendly curiosity that wants more than information, wants the shape of a story to carry around. But in the quiet of early mornings, before the stove heated up and the light came, she thought about it. Her husband Martin had been dead for 11 months. He'd died in debt, which Clara had not known the full extent of until the week after the funeral, when the creditors began arriving with documents. The house had gone first, then the furniture, then the small plot of land Martin had always said would be their security, and that had in fact been pledged against a loan she hadn't known existed. By the time it was finished, Clara had nothing, and the town of Harlow County, which had been perfectly pleasant to her during her marriage, had become uncomfortable in the way that small towns become uncomfortable when a woman loses her usefulness as a wife and becomes instead a reminder of difficulty and misfortune. People had been kind, but kind in the specific way that involves a lot of lowered voices and pitying looks and offers of help that all somehow fell through. Her sister had suggested she come to Denver. Her husband's brother had suggested she might find work in one of the larger towns south. What nobody had suggested was that she might go somewhere entirely new and start something that was hers. The advertisement in the Cheyenne paper, Cook wanted Red Hollow Ranch, Wyoming Territory, inquire Gideon Hale, had been brief and impersonal and entirely unromantic. She'd written the letter sitting at her sister's kitchen table at midnight while her sister's children slept. She hadn't expected an answer. When the answer came, she'd read it 3 times before deciding it was real. And now here she was, in a kitchen that was not hers, but that she'd already begun to think of as hers in the way that you claim a space through labor. In a territory that was hard and flat and cold and smelled of cattle and wood smoke and looked nothing like anything she'd ever known. Surrounded by 12 rough men who had not wanted her and were slowly, reluctantly, figuring out that they did. She thought about all of this in the early mornings. And then the stove heated up, and the day started, and there was no more time to think about it. The trouble with the fence started in the 4th week. It was Gideon who found it, a section of the south pasture fence cut through in 3 places, clean cuts, not damage from an animal or weather. The cattle had drifted 2 miles before anyone noticed, and rounding them up cost nearly a full day of work from 5 hands. When Gideon came in for supper that evening, there was a tightness around his jaw that Clara had learned to read as controlled anger. "What happened?" she asked. "Someone cut the south fence," he said. Clara poured him coffee without being asked. He sat down and stared at the cup for a moment. "Could be drifters," Stubbs offered from his usual seat at the table. "Could be," Gideon said, but his tone suggested he didn't think so. "Ashcroft?" said Decker. Gideon didn't answer directly. "I'll ride the perimeter tomorrow with Rodriguez and check the rest of it." Clara set supper on the table and sat down in her usual place. She'd started eating with the hands somewhere in the 2nd week, which had been a minor shift in the social order of the kitchen that nobody had commented on but that everyone had registered. She ate and listened to the men discuss the fence, the cattle, the cost of the lost day. She didn't insert herself into the conversation, but she listened with more attention than her silence suggested. After supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and she was washing up, Gideon stayed at the table. This was not unusual. He sometimes worked on his tally books in the kitchen in the evenings, and she'd learned not to treat it as something requiring acknowledgement. "You knew something was off with Ashcroft when you met her," he said. Clara wrung out the cloth she'd been using. "She has that quality." "What quality?" "The kind where everything she says means something other than what she's saying." Clara turned around. "She's been patient with you for 4 years. That's a long time to be patient." "I've refused her offers 4 times." "I know." Clara leaned against the counter, "but she came into that store to look at me. She wasn't there for Mrs. Fitch." Gideon turned this over. "What do you think she saw?" "Someone she doesn't understand yet," Clara said. "She understands you. She's had 4 years to study you. I'm new. New things are either useful or dangerous. Which one are you?" The question was, she thought, more genuine than it might have sounded. Gideon was not a man who asked questions he didn't want answered. Clara picked up the coffee pot and refilled his cup and then her own. "I suppose that depends on what happens next," she said. What happened next was the letter. It arrived at the post office in Garnet Creek the following Friday, addressed to Gideon, and he brought it back from his supply run with the kind of careful blankness he wore when something had landed hard and he didn't want it visible. Clara noticed. She said nothing while he read it at the kitchen table, said nothing when he set it down and stared at the far wall for a full minute, and said nothing when he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I need to go to town again Monday," he said. "All right," Clara said. "You should come." She looked up from the bread she was kneading. "You want me to come to town for a legal matter?" He hadn't said it was legal, but he didn't look surprised that she'd known. "There's a meeting at the bank. I might need someone with a clear head who isn't going to say something I'll regret later." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You mean you might say something you'll regret?" "Yes." She pressed the bread down and turned it. "All right," she said again. "I'll come." The meeting at the bank was with a man named Clarence Pruitt, who served as the territory's primary land agent and whose association with Evelyn Ashcroft was, if not open, then poorly concealed. He was 50-ish, precise, and had the specific brand of professional courtesy that is simultaneously polite and designed to make you feel that you are not quite important enough for the room. The letter had concerned a debt. Gideon had taken out a loan 4 years ago against the ranch, but not a large one by the standards of established landowners, but significant by the standards of Red Hollow, which operated on narrow margins and the perpetual uncertainty of cattle ranching in Wyoming. The loan was held by a private creditor, and the creditor, whose name Clara noted carefully, was represented by Pruitt. "The terms are straightforward," Pruitt said, spreading papers across the desk with a kind of deliberate care. "The note comes due at the end of the calendar year. Mr. Hale is of course welcome to seek refinancing, but given the current condition of the ranch's accounts—" "The accounts are fine," Gideon said. "The accounts show a significant operating shortfall following last spring's losses," Pruitt said. "The creditor is concerned." "The creditor?" Clara said. "Or Mrs. Ashcroft?" Pruitt looked at her as if noticing for the first time that she was a person rather than furniture. "I represent the creditor's legal interests, Mrs. Mercer," Clara said. "And the creditor's name?" A pause. "That is a private matter between—" "It's a matter of public record if this goes to the court," Clara said, "which it won't need to if the documentation is in order. Who holds the note?" Pruitt was quiet for slightly too long. "I see," Clara said. Gideon looked at her sideways, not surprised exactly, but with the specific attention of someone recalibrating something. They left the bank with the documentation and the timeline and nothing resolved. On the walk to the wagon, Gideon said, "You've dealt with creditors before." "My husband died in debt," Clara said. "I spent 6 months after that learning things I should have known beforehand." She climbed up to the wagon bench. "The note is hers. Pruitt's name is on the paper, but the money is hers. She's been waiting for the right moment." "And the right moment is now," Gideon said. "The flood damage," Clara said. "The lost cattle last spring, the fence cuts. She's been helping the moment along." He sat very still for a moment. Then he clicked the horses forward, and they rode out of Garnet Creek in silence, with the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the road, and the weight of what was coming settling around them like weather. That evening, after supper, after the hands had gone, Clara sat down at the kitchen table with Gideon's tally books and the loan documents and worked through the numbers until well past midnight. The situation was bad. Not impossible. She'd seen impossible, and this wasn't it, but genuinely bad. The flood damage from earlier that year had cost them more than the books reflected because some of the losses were in grazing land quality, which wouldn't show clearly until spring, and the cattle numbers were lower than they should have been going into winter. The loan coming due was a pressure point designed to break them at exactly the wrong season. She made a list of what they had. She made a list of what they needed. She made a list of options, which was shorter than she would have liked. Gideon came back into the kitchen around midnight, having walked the perimeter of the property in the dark, in the specific way he apparently processed things that were too heavy to sit with. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. "You're still up," he said. "So are you." He came and sat down across from her and looked at what she'd laid out on the table. The tallied columns, the shortfalls circled in pencil, the list of options. He didn't say anything for a long time. He picked up the list of options and read through it. Then he said, "The cattle drive." "It's the strongest option," Clara said. "If the railroad contract holds and prices stay up, you'd clear enough to cover the note with something left over. It's late in the season for a drive." "I know. It's risky." "I know that too." He set the paper down. The kitchen was very quiet, the lamp low, the stove ticking as it cooled. Outside the window, the Wyoming wind was doing what it always did. "Why are you doing this?" he said. The question was genuine. Clara knew the difference by now between Gideon's rhetorical silences and the things he actually needed answered. She thought about it for a moment. "Because this place is worth doing it for," she said, "and because I'm tired of watching things fall apart and deciding there was nothing I could do." He was quiet for another long moment. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Clara gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and went to her room. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind, thinking about a place worth fighting for, and about what it meant, after everything, to have found one. She didn't have an answer for that yet, but she intended to stay long enough to find out. The morning after Clara spread Gideon's books across the kitchen table and circled everything that was wrong with red pencil, she woke up and made breakfast the same as every other morning. Biscuits, salt pork, coffee. She didn't mention the numbers. Neither did he. The hands ate and went to their work, and Clara cleaned the kitchen and started the noon meal, and the ranch moved through the day the way it always did, carrying its trouble the way people carry trouble they're not ready to speak out loud yet, quietly and close to the chest. It was Stubbs who brought the first piece of news in from town 3 days later. He came back from Garnet Creek with the supply wagon and a particular expression that Clara had learned to read. Stubbs was not a gossip by nature, but he was a man with a conscience, and when he knew something that affected people he respected, it sat on him visibly. He unhitched the horses, stacked the supply crates in the kitchen without his usual commentary, and then found a reason to linger near the stove until she looked at him directly. "Something you want to say," she said. It wasn't a question. Stubbs turned his hat over in his hands. "Ran into Ed Pierce at the feed store. He asked me, careful like. You know how Ed asks things. Whether it was true that Gideon had taken on a widow woman from out east who'd lost everything in some kind of scandal." Clara kept her hands moving on the bread dough. "What kind of scandal?" "He didn't say exactly, just a scandal. His wife apparently heard it from the Fitch woman. Mrs. Fitch didn't know anything about me beyond my name and where I came from." "No," Stubbs said. "She didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Somebody put something in the water, Mrs. Mercer. Whatever it is, it didn't come from anyone who actually knows you." Clara pressed the dough down, turned it. "Thank you for telling me, Stubbs." He put his hat back on. "Thought you ought to know," he said, and went back out. She finished the bread and put it in the oven and stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the yard, at the barn, at the line of hills to the north that she'd been watching change color as autumn moved in. She thought about Evelyn Ashcroft in her green coat, with her pale eyes and her careful smile, and she thought about how long 4 years of patience takes to build and how little time it takes to spend it. She wasn't surprised. That was the part that might have broken someone else, the discovery that an attack was already underway before you'd done anything to invite it. But Clara had grown up in the specific school of difficulty that teaches you to be unsurprised by the cruelty of people who feel threatened, and Evelyn Ashcroft had, without question, felt threatened the moment she'd laid eyes on Clara in that general store. What surprised her was the speed of it. She told Gideon that evening after supper, the two of them alone at the table the way they'd fallen into the habit of being, the hands gone, the kitchen quiet, the lamp turned low. She laid it out plainly, without drama, because Gideon responded better to plain. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his coffee cup. "Ed Pierce," he said. "Pierce is the one who repeated it. It didn't start with him." "No." Gideon's jaw was tight. "Pierce is a good man who repeats things without thinking. He's a tool, not the hand using it." "She's moving faster than I expected," Clara said. "She's never had a reason to move fast before." He looked at Clara steadily. "She does now." Clara met his look. There was something in his directness that she'd come to appreciate in a way she hadn't fully understood yet. Gideon Hale didn't flatter, didn't soften, didn't say things sideways to protect your feelings. If he said something, he meant it. That quality, in a man, was rarer than it should have been. "I can be more careful," she said. Stay closer to the ranch. Give her less to work with. That won't stop her." "No," Clara agreed, "but it might slow her down." Gideon shook his head slowly. "Hiding from Evelyn Ashcroft is not a strategy. It's surrender at a lower speed." "Then what do you suggest?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm not going to let her run you out of here with lies." He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, without additional weight on it. But it landed on Clara with more weight than she'd been prepared for, and she had to look away toward the window for a moment before she could answer. "All right," she said, "then we figure it out together." The wind outside had picked up. Through the kitchen window, the lantern light in the barn swayed on its hook, casting moving shadows across the yard. Clara refilled the coffee, and they sat a while longer without talking, which with Gideon had become its own kind of conversation. The rumors spread the way rumors do in a territory where everyone knows everyone, and winter is coming and there's not much else to occupy people's minds. By the following week, Clara heard the second version from Tomas, who'd overheard it at the blacksmith's in Garnet Creek when he went in to get a shoe reset. This version had her arriving at Red Hollow with debts of her own, debts that might somehow transfer to the ranch. The version after that, which reached her through Decker of all people, who reported it with a straight face and careful eyes, suggested that her husband's death had not been entirely natural. Decker had looked at her when he said it, watching for the flinch. She didn't flinch. "My husband died of a fever," she said. "He was sick for 3 weeks. There were 4 people in the house with him when he died, including a doctor." "I know," Decker said. "I'm just telling you what's going around." "I know you are." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork over in his hand. "Because if you're going to fight it, you need to know what you're fighting," he said finally. "And because—" He stopped. "The woman spreading it is the same woman who made life difficult for May Tully before she left. May didn't deserve it either." Clara looked at him with genuine attention for the first time since she'd arrived. Decker, she'd concluded early on, was a man whose roughness was mostly a habit he'd never bothered to set down. Underneath it, there was more than she'd originally credited. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged with the exaggerated indifference of a man who'd given more than he meant to. "Don't make it into something," he said, and picked up his fork. What made it into something was Gideon. It happened in Garnet Creek on a Wednesday, at the feed store. Clara hadn't been there. She'd been at the dry goods counter 2 buildings down, when Gideon walked into the feed store and found Henry Crail, one of the territory's bigger ranchers, and a man whose opinion other men tended to follow, holding forth to 3 other men about the particular rumor regarding Martin Mercer's death. Crail was not a malicious man in the deliberate sense. He was the kind of man who repeated things because repetition felt like participation in something larger than himself. He had a big voice and used it freely. Gideon walked in and Crail stopped mid-sentence. The silence held for a moment. "Henry?" Gideon said pleasantly. "Gideon." Crail's face had done something complicated. "Didn't hear you come in." "I gathered." Gideon picked up a paper sack of oats from the shelf and turned it over in his hands. "Finish what you were saying." It was nothing important." "Didn't sound like nothing." The other 3 men had gone very quiet. The feed store owner had found something to do behind the counter that apparently required all of his attention. Crail cleared his throat. "I was just repeating what I'd heard." "From who?" A pause. "It's just talk, Gideon." Gideon set the oats down and looked at Crail with the particular quality of attention he applied to things that needed to be addressed directly. "Clara Mercer works for me. She's done her job without complaint since the day she arrived, and there's not a man on my ranch who's got a single honest word to say against her. What you were repeating just now isn't talk. It's a lie. I'd appreciate it if you treated it as one." Crail opened his mouth, closed it. "I'd also appreciate knowing where you heard it," Gideon said, "though I expect I already do." He paid for what he needed and left. Clara heard about it from Mrs. Fitch, of all people, when she went to settle the dry goods bill. Mrs. Fitch told it with a kind of suppressed satisfaction that suggested she'd found Evelyn Ashcroft's methods distasteful, even while partly participating in spreading them, which was a contradiction Clara found perfectly characteristic of the woman. "He didn't raise his voice," Mrs. Fitch said. "He just said it flat out, in front of 4 men who'll tell 4 more by the end of the week. That's Gideon Hale for you." Clara walked back to the wagon slowly, thinking about a man who had stood in a feed store and stated a plain thing plainly, without being asked to, without being thanked for it, without any expectation that she would ever know he'd done it. He was already at the wagon when she got there. She climbed up, sat down beside him, and looked straight ahead at the road. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and clicked the horses forward. The flood came at the end of October. It was the broken creek that did it, a stream that ran along the eastern edge of the property and that in dry months was barely worth mentioning, but that in wet years could become something else entirely. That autumn had been unusually wet following an unusually dry summer, and the ground was too hard packed to absorb what came down, and what came down over 3 days in late October was enough to turn Broken Creek into something angry and gray and unwilling to stay in its banks. The water came up in the night. Tomas was the one who heard it. He'd been restless for reasons he didn't explain and had gone out around 2 in the morning and come back running, banging on the bunkhouse door with both fists. What followed was several hours of the specific chaos that happens when men who are competent at their individual tasks have to coordinate quickly in the dark. The horses came first. All 8 of them moved to higher ground without much incident, though 2 of them were difficult about it. The cattle in the south pasture were a different problem. By the time they reached the south gate, the water was already ankle-deep across the low section of the field, and moving 200 head of cattle in the dark and rain with lanterns that kept threatening to go out required the full complement of 12 men and resulted in 3 hands getting thrown, 1 sprained wrist, and Decker taking a kick to the ribs that would trouble him for 2 weeks, but that he refused to acknowledge as serious. Clara didn't stay in the kitchen. She'd gotten up when she heard Tomas running, assessed what was happening, and made a decision in about 30 seconds. The kitchen was on high ground. The root cellar was not. She spent the first hour moving everything she could carry from the root cellar to the kitchen. The preserved goods, the winter stores, the smoked meat, the sacks of flour and cornmeal. The water didn't reach the root cellar that night, but it reached the bottom step, and if it had gone 2 inches higher, the winter food supply would have been lost. Then she built the fire up hot, put on every pot she had, and by the time the men came back in from the fields, wet to the skin, mud from the knees down, exhausted in the particular way of people who've been running on alarm, there was hot coffee, hot broth, and enough food for everyone. Nobody said thank you in so many words. They didn't, out here. But the way men eat when they're grateful is different from the way they eat when they're just hungry, and Clara recognized the difference. The damage, tallied in daylight, was real. The south pasture was torn up badly. The lower section had flooded, and the grass would take until spring to recover, which meant reduced grazing capacity all winter. 2 of the outbuildings had taken water damage. The root cellar would need to be resealed before it could be properly used again. 3 sections of fence were down along the creek bank. Gideon walked the damage in the morning and came back looking like a man who'd been handed a bill he already knew he couldn't fully pay. Clara set a plate in front of him and sat down across from him. "Tell me the actual number," she said. He told her. It was worse than the number from the tally books 3 weeks ago. "All right," Clara said. He looked at her. "All right? All right. We know what it is now. That's better than not knowing." She folded her hands on the table. "The railroad contract, is it still possible?" "Possible," Gideon said. "Not easy. It was never going to be easy." She leaned forward slightly. "How many head can you move?" "If we push it, 80, maybe 90, enough to make the contract if the price holds." "When does the contract close?" "They want delivery before the first hard freeze. 6 weeks, maybe 7. "Then that's what we're doing," Clara said. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she hadn't quite seen before. Not surprise, exactly, because she'd given him reasons by now to stop being surprised by her. More like the specific look of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for a long time and has just had someone put their hands on the other side of it. "It's my ranch," he said. Not unkindly, just stating a fact. "I know," Clara said. "And I work here. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He was quiet. "You defended me in that feed store," she said. "You didn't have to. I'm telling you, I'm not going anywhere. That's what I can offer back." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not the kind of shift that makes a good scene in a story. Just the subtle change of a man deciding something and feeling the tension go out of it. "I'll talk to the hands tonight," he said. The preparation for the cattle drive took everything the ranch had. Decker, despite his bruised ribs, threw himself into it with a specific energy that Clara suspected had something to do with a desire to prove useful in a situation that was clearly serious. He was good at logistics in the rough way of a man who'd never been formally trained in anything but had a natural grasp of how to move things from one place to another without losing them. He and Gideon spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table with a map and a tally sheet, working out the route and the staging and how many hands they needed for the drive versus how many needed to stay and keep the ranch running. Clara fed them and stayed at the edges of those conversations, listening. When they hit a problem with the water stop at Caldwell Creek, which might still be running high from the flood, she said, without looking up from the sock she was mending. "Ed Pierce's property runs the north bank of Caldwell Creek. His son rode dispatch for the railroad 2 years ago. He might know the current water levels, and he might let you use his land for the approach." Both men looked at her. "Pierce repeats things," she said, "but he's not a bad man. He'll help if you ask him straight." Gideon looked at Decker. Decker shrugged. "Worth asking," Decker said. Pierce, when Gideon rode out to ask him, said yes within 10 minutes of the conversation. Stubbs was staying behind to manage the ranch, while Gideon and most of the hands made the drive. He came to Clara on the morning the drive was being staged and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, which she'd learned was his posture for serious things. "You're going to be here with me and Tomas and young Rivers while they're gone," he said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. "I know," Clara said. "Ashcroft's people have been riding the boundary roads more than usual." Clara looked up from the supply manifest she was checking. "You've seen them?" Rodriguez mentioned it before he left with the drive crew. 2 riders on the East Road, regular intervals. He paused. "Could be nothing." "Could be," Clara said, "but we'll be careful." "I wanted to make sure you weren't—" He stopped himself. Started again. "I wanted to make sure you knew what kind of place you were staying in." Clara set down the manifest and gave him her full attention. "Stubbs, why did May Tully really leave?" He was quiet for a moment. "She got scared," he said finally. "Ashcroft went after her different than she's going after you. May had a sister in town that Ashcroft could pressure, a nephew who needed work. May wasn't built to withstand that kind of thing. She left because staying felt like it was going to cost her more than she had." "I don't have a sister in town," Clara said. "I don't have a nephew who needs work." She looked at him steadily. "I don't have anything she can take from me that I haven't already lost." Stubbs studied her, then he nodded slowly. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you do." The morning Gideon left with the drive crew, Clara was up before 4 as always, and she packed trail food, cornbread, smoked meat, dried apples, coffee enough for a week, and had it loaded into the supply wagon before any of the men had fully finished their breakfast. When the horses were ready and the herd was moving, Gideon came to the kitchen door. He had his trail coat on, the one with the mended left shoulder she'd sewn up 2 weeks ago. He was carrying his hat. "The ranch is yours while I'm gone," he said. "The ranch is yours," she said. "I'll just keep it in one piece until you get back." Something almost warm moved across his face. "Don't let Stubbs drink the good coffee." "He already drinks the good coffee. He just thinks I don't know." This time the smile made it all the way. It was a brief thing, unguarded, the kind that happened when a person forgot to manage their expression for a second. Clara stored it away without meaning to. "Get a good price," she said. "I'll get the best price I can." "Get a good one," she said again. He put his hat on and went to his horse. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the drive crew move the cattle out through the gate and down the road south, the dust rising in the cold morning air, Gideon's dark coat at the back of the herd, getting smaller. She watched until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went back inside, put the kettle on, and started thinking about what the next 3 weeks were going to require. The fire snapped in the stove. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the empty yard. The ranch was quiet in the specific way it gets when the people who fill it are gone. Not empty, just waiting. Clara had been many things in her life. A daughter, a wife, a widow, a woman with nothing left. She had been dismissed and pitied and talked about and written off. She had walked 3 miles down a dirt road with a broken trunk and found a place that asked nothing of her but work, and she had given it more than that without intending to. She was not leaving it. Whatever Evelyn Ashcroft was planning in the weeks ahead, whatever was coming down that East Road with regular riders and a patience that had been building for 4 years, Clara would be here when it arrived. She had nowhere else to be. And for the first time in a long time, that felt less like a limitation and more like a choice. The first week without Gideon and most of the hands was quieter than Clara had expected, and not in a good way. The quiet had texture to it. A particular kind of held-breath stillness that she'd felt before, in the weeks after Martin died, when the house had been too empty and every sound she made seemed too loud against it. She wasn't grieving now. That wasn't it. But the ranch without its full crew was like a sentence missing its subject, and she found herself filling the silence with work the way she always had, pushing through the inventory of tasks that needed doing before winter set in hard. The root cellar resealing, the kitchen larder restocked with what the flood had displaced, the window frames in the main house caulked against the cold that was already arriving in the mornings with a seriousness that left frost on the pump handle before sunup. Tomas and young Rivers, a hand of 19 who hadn't been at the ranch long enough to have a history there yet, helped where they could without her having to ask directly, which she appreciated. Stubbs managed the remaining cattle and the daily operation of the property and checked in with her each evening with the brief functional communication of a man who respected her enough not to explain things she already knew. The trouble arrived on day 9. It came in the form of a woman named Hargrove, Mrs. Adelaide Hargrove, wife of one of the associate ranchers in the territory, who arrived at the ranch in a very clean buggy on a Tuesday morning that Clara had been planning to spend resealing the root cellar. Mrs. Hargrove was perhaps 45, dressed for a social call, with the specific energy of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is determined to say it. Clara met her at the door. "Mrs. Mercer," she said brightly, "I'm Adelaide Hargrove. My husband runs the Hargrove spread about 12 miles east. I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," Clara said. "Come in." She gave the woman coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table and waited. Mrs. Hargrove admired the kitchen, asked about the flood damage she'd heard about, made 2 observations about the difficulty of managing a ranch in the autumn months. Then she set down her cup and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has decided to be kind about something unpleasant. "I'll be direct," she said, which Clara had learned usually meant the opposite. "Please," Clara said anyway. "There's been considerable talk in the territory about your position here, about the nature of your arrangement with Mr. Hale." She paused delicately. "People are concerned. You're a widow, living on a man's property, managing his household in his absence. It puts you in a difficult position socially, and it puts him in a difficult position as well." "I'm employed here," Clara said. "As a cook." "Of course," Mrs. Hargrove nodded with careful neutrality. "But you understand how it looks, particularly given some of the stories that have been circulating." "I'm aware of the stories," Clara said. "I'm also aware of where they came from." A small hesitation. "Well, I wouldn't know about that. I'm only here because I thought it right to tell you, woman to woman, that if you have any concern for Mr. Hale's reputation, for both your reputations, it might be worth thinking about whether this arrangement can continue as it is." She smoothed her skirt. "Some of the ranchers' wives have begun to feel they can't include either of you in territory social events, given the ambiguity." Clara looked at her steadily for a moment. "Mrs. Hargrove, who asked you to come here?" The woman's chin lifted slightly. "Nobody asked me. I came on my own initiative." Clara stood, collected the coffee cups. "Thank you for your concern. I'll give your advice the consideration it deserves." Mrs. Hargrove left 10 minutes later, her buggy raising a thin line of dust down the road south. Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched it go, and felt the particular cold anger that comes not from being attacked, but from being handled, from someone deciding that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to honestly. She went back to resealing the root cellar, but the visit sat in her mind, and she turned it over while she worked, and by the time she'd finished for the day and the sun was going down behind the hills, she'd decided something. She wrote Gideon a letter that night. Short, factual. She described the Hargrove visit without commentary. She described what the woman had said, and at the end she wrote, "When you return, there's something we need to discuss about how we move forward. I have a proposal. It can wait until you're back." She sealed it and gave it to Stubbs to send with the next rider going south, in case Gideon could be reached at one of the drive staging posts. The second week brought something worse than a social call. Pruitt came himself, not to the ranch directly, but to Garnet Creek, and word reached Clara through Mrs. Fitch, who sent a note via the dry goods boy that Pruitt had been seen at the bank with a man from the Territorial Land Office, whose name Mrs. Fitch didn't know, but whose presence she found worth mentioning. Clara rode into town the next morning. She hadn't ridden much before coming to Red Hollow, but she'd been practicing, and she managed the 8 miles without incident, if not with grace, and found Mrs. Fitch behind her counter with the alert expression of someone who has been waiting. The man from the land office was named Garrett. Clara found him still at the bank, finishing a meeting with the manager, and she introduced herself and sat down before anyone had quite decided whether to invite her. Garrett was 50-ish, territorial bureaucrat, not unkind, but cautious in the way of people who've learned that every conversation in range disputes is a potential liability. He had the loan documentation on the table. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, with the slight hesitation of a man recalibrating his prepared remarks. "I wasn't expecting. I was told Mr. Hale would be available." "Mr. Hale is conducting a cattle drive," Clara said. "I manage the ranch accounts in his absence." This was somewhat more than the truth as it had been formally stated, but it was entirely true in practice, and she said it without blinking. Garrett looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at Clara with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he thought he'd controlled. "Mrs. Mercer, the matters at hand are legal in nature and require Mr. Hale's direct—" "The note terms," Clara said. 30 days from the date of formal demand. That demand was dated the 14th. By my count, Mr. Hale has 19 days remaining. Nothing in the note requires his personal presence at preliminary discussions." She folded her hands on the table. "Unless you're here to issue something other than a preliminary discussion." Pruitt was very still. Garrett cleared his throat. "The creditor has expressed interest in an accelerated resolution," he said carefully. "The creditor can express whatever she likes," Clara said. "The legal terms are the legal terms. Unless there's been an amendment to the original note that I'm not aware of." Another silence. "There hasn't been," Garrett said. "Then Mr. Hale has 19 days. Clara stood. "I'll inform him of this meeting when he returns. If there are formal documents requiring his signature, you can send them to the ranch." She looked at Pruitt with the specific clarity she'd developed in 6 months of dealing with Martin's creditors. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pruitt." She walked out of the bank and across the street to the hitching post and stood with her hand on the horse's neck for a moment, feeling her heart going faster than the situation strictly warranted. She'd learned during Martin's debts how to appear calmer than she was in rooms with men who held paper that could ruin her. She'd gotten better at it with practice, but it still cost something each time. She rode back to Red Hollow and went straight to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee and sat down with the loan documents she'd kept a copy of since that first bank meeting with Gideon and read through them again carefully, looking for anything she might have missed. There was a clause. She'd noticed it before but hadn't given it full weight. A provision about the note's terms in the event of what the document called a material change in the property's management structure. It was vague, the way legal language is sometimes deliberately vague, but it could, under certain interpretations, be used to accelerate the timeline if the creditor argued that a significant change had occurred in who controlled the property. She read it 3 more times. Then she understood what Evelyn Ashcroft was actually doing. Not just pressuring Gideon with the debt, building a legal argument that the ranch's situation, a mostly absent owner, a woman managing the property who had no formal standing, a reduced crew, flood damage, constituted a management change significant enough to trigger early repayment. It was clever. It was the kind of move that required a lawyer and a patient mind, and Evelyn Ashcroft apparently had both. Clara sat with this for a long time. The fire in the stove settled and she got up and added wood to it and sat back down and kept thinking. The proposal she'd written to Gideon in her letter had been cautious. She'd framed it as something to discuss, which was the careful language of a woman who'd learned not to put too much of herself into a suggestion before knowing whether it would be welcome. But looking at the clause, at the legal architecture Evelyn was building, she understood that caution was a luxury they no longer had the time for. What would give Clara formal standing, legal standing, the kind that could block the management change argument entirely, was not a contract of employment. She knew what it was. She'd known it since the Hargrove woman sat across from her and talked about appearances and ambiguity. She just hadn't let herself say it plainly until now. Gideon came back on a Thursday evening, 22 days after he'd left, riding ahead of the rest of the crew by half a day because he'd pushed his horse harder on the final stretch than was strictly sensible. Clara heard the hoofbeats in the yard and came to the kitchen door, and he was already off the horse, looking road-worn and tired and like a man who'd been sleeping on the ground for 3 weeks. He looked at her first thing, not at the ranch, not at the barn, at her. "Everything's still standing," she said. "I can see that." He handed the reins to Tomas, who'd appeared from somewhere. "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table and she put food in front of him. He ate fast and without ceremony, the way men do when they've been living on trail provisions. And while he ate, she laid out what had happened. The Hargrove visit, the bank meeting, Pruitt and the land office man, the management clause. He listened the way he always did. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he pushed the plate aside and looked at the loan documents she'd spread out. "The clause," he said. "She's going to argue that the ranch has undergone a material change in management. She'll use the flood damage, the drive, the fact that you were absent for 3 weeks with a woman who has no formal role running things." "You have a formal role. You're the cook." "That's not formal standing for property management purposes. Legally." She paused. She may have already filed a preliminary argument. Garrett was here to assess whether the grounds exist. Gideon was quiet, looking at the papers. I received your letter, he said. The part about the proposal. Yes. Tell me what you meant. Clara had thought about how to say this for 9 days. She'd drafted it and discarded it and drafted it again, and in the end she'd decided the only way was the way Gideon himself operated, plainly, without decorating it into something it wasn't. Marriage, she said. I'm not saying this because of anything other than the legal situation. If we're married, there is no management change. My standing is established. The clause has no argument, and the social pressure Ashcroft has been applying loses most of its force because the ambiguity she's been weaponizing disappears. Gideon was very still. It protects the ranch, Claire said, and it ends the campaign she's been running against both of us in this territory. The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable, and Clara sat with it without trying to fill it, because she'd learned that Gideon's silences required that. You'd be marrying a man you've known for 2 months, he said. I know. On a ranch that's in debt and may not survive the next 30 days regardless. I know that too. And if we lose the ranch anyway, then we lose it having done everything we could, Clara said. I'm not asking you to promise me anything beyond what this moment requires. I'm asking if you're willing. He looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he rarely did. Not the flat assessment from the first day, not the practical measuring of someone deciding whether a situation was manageable, but the actual look of a person trying to understand another person. Why? He said. It was the same question he'd asked her weeks ago in the kitchen at midnight, and she knew he meant the same thing. Not why marriage, but why are you still here? Because I told you I wasn't leaving, she said. That wasn't a position I intended to revisit. Another long silence. All right, he said. Clara exhaled. She hadn't known she'd been holding her breath until she let it go. All right, she said back. Boom. They married 4 days later in Garnet Creek, at the magistrate's office, with Stubbs and Mrs. Fitch as witnesses. It was not a romantic occasion by any conventional standard. The magistrate was a practical man who read the required language in about 4 minutes and asked them each twice if they understood what they were agreeing to, which Clara suspected he added because he'd had occasion to find out that people sometimes didn't. Mrs. Fitch cried a little, which she apologized for immediately. Stubbs shook Gideon's hand and then, after a brief pause, Clara's, with the particular formality of a man marking something as significant. Gideon had worn his good shirt, which she noted without comment. Walking out of the magistrate's office into the cold November air, Clara felt the weight of what had just happened settle around her in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. Not heavy exactly, but present. Real. The kind of real that comes when something you've been treating as a plan becomes a fact. Gideon walked beside her to the wagon. He didn't take her hand, which she hadn't expected him to. They drove back to Red Hollow in the usual way, which was mostly quiet, the road stretching out ahead of them through the bare autumn hills. About halfway home, he said, for what it's worth, I think it's possible this becomes something more than what it is right now. Clara looked at the road. I think so too, she said. Eventually. I'm not a patient man about most things, he said. But I can be patient about that. I know, she said. And she did. She'd been watching him for 2 months, and she knew exactly what kind of patience he had and didn't have. And this was not a man who said things to fill silence. The wagon rolled on. The hills were brown and the sky was high and pale, and the wind had the first real edge of winter in it. Red Hollow appeared ahead, the dark shapes of the buildings against the hills, smoke beginning to rise from the bunkhouse chimney where Tomas had gotten the fire going. Clara looked at it, at the solid fence post, the patched barn roof, the swept yard, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in quite a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But the specific foundation that happiness is built on, when you finally stop running and look at where you've landed and decide deliberately that you're going to stay. The formal demand arrived 2 days after they returned from Garnet Creek. Pruitt himself delivered it, which suggested Evelyn had been watching for Gideon's return. He came to the ranch in the late afternoon and handed over the documents at the door with the careful professionalism of a man doing a job he may have had some private reservations about. The demand cited the note terms, referenced the full amount owed, and set a formal deadline of 30 days from the date of service. Clara took the documents and thanked Pruitt, which seemed to unsettle him slightly. When she brought the papers to Gideon, who was at the kitchen table, he looked at them for a long time. 30 days, he said. The cattle drive proceeds, Clara said. What did you get? He looked up at her. For the first time since he'd come back, something like relief moved across his face, not because the news was good, but because she'd asked the right question. Better than I expected. Price held. I cleared enough to make a serious dent, but not enough to cover the full note. How much short? He told her. It was a real number. Not catastrophic, but real. The gap between what the drive had cleared and what the note required. Clara looked at it, turned it over in her head the way she turned numbers over, finding the angles. What else can we sell? I'm not selling cattle below the herd number we need for spring. I'm not suggesting cattle, she thought. The North Timber section. You don't graze it. You've never mentioned using it. It's not much. It's something. And the railroad that bought your cattle, they're still building west. They buy timber. He was quiet. That might work for part of it. And I have money, Clara said. Gideon looked at her. Not a lot, she said. I kept what I had separate from Martin's accounts. His creditors couldn't touch it because it was in my name before the marriage. She met his eyes. It's not enough alone. But combined with the drive money and the timber. That's your money, he said. It's my ranch now too, she said. Legally, as of 4 days ago. He held her gaze for a long moment. The lamp between them on the table cast an even light across the tally books, the loan documents, the careful columns she'd been keeping since the day she'd arrived and found a half-eaten biscuit and a kitchen that needed someone to run it. I'll pay it back, he said. You don't need to. Clara. His voice had a particular quality. Not commanding, not defensive, just clear. I'll pay it back. She understood. Some things a man needs to say not because they're practical, but because they're the only way he knows to tell you what you mean to him. She recognized that language. Martin had never spoken it. It was the first time she'd heard it from a man and understood it for what it was. All right, she said. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the yard and rattled the kitchen window in its frame. The 30-day clock was running. The money wasn't assembled yet, and the timber sale wasn't arranged, and there were 29 days remaining in which Evelyn Ashcroft could still win everything she'd been patient for. But Clara Mercer, Clara Hale now, though she hadn't quite gotten used to the sound of it, sat at the table with her husband in the lamplight and looked at the numbers and did not feel afraid. She felt, if anything, ready. The timber sale took 11 days to arrange, which was 11 days of Gideon riding between the ranch and the railroad's regional office in a town called Dunbar, 40 miles north, and 11 days of Clara managing the accounts, the remaining hands, the ranch itself, and the specific low-grade anxiety of watching the calendar move while the numbers didn't quite add up yet. The railroad buyer was a man named Prescott, who had the specific negotiating manner of someone who knew he was the only buyer within 100 miles and conducted himself accordingly. Gideon came back from the second meeting looking like he'd been arguing with a wall. He's offering 60% of what the timber's worth, he said, sitting down at the kitchen table with his coat still on. Then he doesn't get it yet, Clara said. We need the money. We need the right money. There's a difference. She sat down across from him. What did he say when you pushed back? That he'd find timber elsewhere. He won't. Not this quality. Not this close to the line they're building. She looked at Gideon steadily. Go back tomorrow. Tell him 75%, or the timber stays on the land. Then wait. And if he walks? He won't walk. Men like Prescott make a show of walking. It's the move before they agree. She paused. My husband dealt with a man like that once. A merchant in Harlow County who bought wool. Every season he'd announce he was going elsewhere. Every season he came back. Because there was nowhere else to go and everyone knew it, including him. Gideon looked at her. Your husband dealt with him. My husband watched me deal with him, Clara said. Martin was better with cattle than merchants. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Not quite amusement, but the thing adjacent to it. 75%. And tell him the railroad gets first option on the second stand north of the creek, if they pay fair on this one. He was quiet a moment, turning this over. That might actually work. I know, she said. He went back to Dunbar the next morning. He came back 2 days later with a signed agreement at 72% and first option on the north stand. Clara looked at the number and decided not to say she'd expected 75, because some victories are better received without commentary. Combined with the cattle drive proceeds and her own savings, which she transferred formally and without sentiment, they were within reach of the note's full amount. Not comfortably within reach. The way a person stretching for something is within reach, where if anything shifts, you might miss it. She put the final tally on paper and slid it across the table to Gideon. He looked at it for a long time. 15 days left, he said. 14, Clara said. Pruitt will count from the morning, not the evening. What they hadn't fully anticipated was that Evelyn Ashcroft would find out about the timber sale. She found out within 48 hours, which told Clara something about how thoroughly Evelyn had built her information network across the territory. It also told her that Prescott or someone in his office had connections to Ashcroft's operation, a detail worth filing away. The response came not through Pruitt this time, but through a different channel entirely. Henry Crail appeared at the ranch gate on a Wednesday morning. The same Henry Crail from the feed store, the man Gideon had corrected publicly, and who had apparently, since that episode, been doing some thinking about where his loyalties lay. He came alone, which Clara noted, and he asked for Gideon, and when Gideon came out to the gate, Crail turned his hat over in his hands and said, without much preamble, "She's calling a ranchers' meeting next Friday at the Garnet Creek Hall. Association business. Official notice." He paused. "I've seen her do this before. She uses the association to build a consensus, and then the consensus becomes the territory's position on whatever she wants the territory's position to be." Gideon was quiet. "What's the stated agenda?" "Water rights on the eastern tributary, but that's not what it'll be about." Crail looked uncomfortable in the way of a large man who has decided to do something that costs him something. "The real agenda will be you, her, the debt. She's going to make a case to the other ranchers that a land seizure on Red Hollow would benefit the whole territory's water allocation, because your eastern boundary runs along the shared tributary and she'd manage it different." "That's a long way around to say she wants my land," Gideon said. "It's a legal long way around," Crail said. "And in a room full of men who've been hearing stories about Red Hollow for the last 2 months, it might work." Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then, "Why are you telling me this, Henry?" Crail was quiet. "Because what she did to your wife, the stories she spread, my wife heard those stories and repeated some of them before she knew better. And when she found out where they'd come from and what the truth was, she wasn't pleased with herself." He put his hat back on. "That's not the kind of territory I want to live in." He rode off. Gideon watched him go and then came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara. "You heard," he said. "Most of it," Clara said. She was at the counter and she kept her hands moving on what she was doing, because keeping her hands moving helped her think. She's not waiting for the deadline. No, she's building a second route in case the debt doesn't work. The association meeting. Clara turned around. If she gets the association to endorse a territorial water management proposal that includes your eastern boundary, she can tie it up in territorial court long enough to exhaust whatever money you have left. Even after we pay the note. Especially after. Because then the debt argument is gone and she needs something else. Clara looked at him. "She's thorough." "She is," Gideon said. There was a flatness in his voice that she recognized as the way he sounded when he was genuinely angry. Not the quick anger of a provoked man, but the slow, controlled anger of someone who has been patient a long time and is reaching the end of it. "Then we go to the meeting," Clara said. "I was going to say the same thing. Both of us." He looked at her. "You want to speak?" "I think I need to." She held his gaze. "She's been using me as the argument for 3 months. Every story, every rumor, every whispered thing in Mrs. Fitch's store, it was all about me. About what I am and what I'm not and whether I belong here. If I sit in the back of that room and let you speak while I'm quiet, I'm agreeing with her version of me." She paused. "I'm not agreeing with her version of me." Gideon looked at her for a long moment with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things he was deciding. "You know those men," he said. "Some of them have been hearing Evelyn's version of you for months." "I know. Some of them won't be open to a different version no matter what you say." "I know that too." She didn't look away from him. "But Some of them will. And those are the ones that matter. He nodded once. All right, he said. We go together. The 10 days between Crail's visit and the association meeting were some of the most pressured Clara had known since Martin's creditors had started arriving. The debt repayment still had to be arranged. The actual transfer of funds had to be done through the bank, documented properly, timed carefully to ensure it landed before Pruitt could claim the deadline had passed. Gideon handled the bank side of it, writing to Garnet Creek twice to ensure the paperwork was in order. Clara managed the ranch accounts and kept a running record of every transaction in case it was ever challenged, because she'd learned in Martin's aftermath that clean records were the difference between winning and losing a financial dispute. She also prepared for the meeting, not in an obvious way. She didn't write a speech, didn't rehearse in front of Stubbs, didn't tell anyone what she intended to say, but she thought about it every evening, working through the shape of it the way she worked through the numbers, looking for where the weaknesses were, where the arguments needed to be airtight, what the room would need from her that wasn't just information but something more human and harder to dismiss. She thought about what Evelyn Ashcroft had built and how she'd built it. The rumors had all been about Clara's inadequacy, her doubtful past, her suspicious presence, her unclear status on a man's property. The through line of every story was the same thing. This woman doesn't belong here. It was efficient. It was designed to make every man in that territory ask, before he ever met her, what is she really? What she'd decided to do was answer that question directly. Not defensively, not with anger, just directly. Gideon found her at the kitchen table late one night, 4 days before the meeting, with a cup of cold coffee and a piece of paper that had been written on and crossed out several times. You're practicing, he said. I'm thinking. He sat down. Tell me what you're going to say. She looked at him. I'm going to tell them the truth, all of it. Where I came from, what happened to Martin, what I came here with, what I didn't have. She paused. Every story Evelyn told about me had a shadow of the truth in it. I was a widow with a dead husband who left debts. I did arrive with almost nothing. I don't have family connections in this territory. All of that is real. She just put the wrong meaning on it. And you're going to put the right meaning on it. I'm going to let them decide what the meaning is, Clara said. I'm just going to give them the actual facts. She looked down at the paper. Men like these, if you tell them what to think, some of them will resist it on principle. But if you give them the truth and let them arrive at it themselves, it sticks. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That's a risk. Everything we've done in the last 30 days has been a risk. Fair, he said. He looked at the paper but didn't try to read it. You're not what I expected, he said, when you knocked on that door. What did you expect? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Someone more careful, more concerned with making herself acceptable. I spent a long time being careful, Clara said. It didn't protect me from anything. No, he said. I don't suppose it did. They sat in the quiet kitchen a while longer, and it was the kind of quiet that had changed its quality from the early days. Not the tentative silence of two people still figuring out how to be in a room together, but something more settled, more known. Outside, the first real snow of winter was beginning to fall, the flakes visible in the light from the barn, small and unhurried, beginning to cover the yard. The debt was paid on a Tuesday, 3 days before the meeting. Gideon and Clara drove to Garnet Creek together and walked into the bank together, and Gideon laid the full payment across Clarence Pruitt's desk in documented, certified form, every cent of the note plus the interest that had accumulated, and asked for a receipt. Pruitt's face during this transaction was a study in controlled disappointment. He wrote the receipt with the precision of a man performing a task he found distasteful, and signed it and dated it and handed it across the desk without comment. Gideon folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Tell Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, that Red Hollow Ranch is no longer encumbered. Pruitt said nothing. Clara had been standing to the side, and she picked up her copy of the receipt and her copy of the transaction record and put them in her bag and looked at Pruitt with an expression that was not unkind and was not triumphant. It was simply the look of a woman who has finished one part of something and is ready for the next. Good afternoon, she said. Walking out of the bank into the cold December air, Gideon let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. Clara felt it too. the specific release of a pressure that had been constant long enough that you'd stopped noticing how much it weighed until it was gone. "One thing down," he said. "Friday's still coming," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "You all right? You?" The question surprised her slightly, not because it was unwelcome, but because he asked it so directly, without the usual framing of "how are you" or "is everything fine," just the plain "are you all right?" which was exactly the question and nothing else. "I will be," she said, "after Friday." He nodded. "Then let's go home." The Garnet Creek Association Hall was a long, plain building that smelled of sawdust and the residue of 100 previous meetings. By 7 o'clock on Friday evening, it held approximately 30 men, ranchers, associate landowners, a few territorial officials, and the particular category of men who attend civic meetings primarily to have attended them. They sat in rows of rough chairs with their coats on because the stove in the corner was fighting a losing battle against the December cold. Evelyn Ashcroft was already there when Clara and Gideon arrived, seated near the front with two men Clara didn't recognize. Lawyers, she thought, from the look of their coats. Evelyn's expression when she saw them enter was the most genuinely surprised Clara had seen her, and it lasted only a fraction of a second before the careful composure returned. The meeting was run by a man named Fowler, who served as the association's chair, and who had the weary energy of someone who'd believed when he took the position that it would involve less conflict than it apparently did. He called the meeting to order, went through 2 items of actual association business efficiently, and then introduced the water rights discussion with the careful neutrality of a man trying to appear impartial while clearly aware that the room was charged with something larger than water rights. Evelyn spoke first. She was good at it. Clara had to acknowledge that. She laid out the water allocation argument with precision and apparent reasonableness, referencing territorial law, citing documented water levels on the eastern tributary, and weaving into it, with the subtlety of someone who'd done this before, a series of observations about the management instability at Red Hollow Ranch over the preceding months. She didn't say anything directly accusatory. She didn't have to. The implications were architectural, built carefully enough that they stood on their own. Several men asked questions. Evelyn answered them all well. Clara watched the room and watched how the weight of it shifted, and she understood what she was dealing with. Not a crowd of enemies, but a crowd of uncertain men who had been fed a particular story for months and had no competing story to hold against it. Fowler asked if anyone else wished to speak to the matter. Gideon stood. He said clearly and without embellishment that the debt on Red Hollow Ranch had been paid in full 3 days prior, that he had the documentation, and that the water rights on his eastern boundary had been managed responsibly for 11 years and would continue to be. He said it in about 4 sentences, sat down, and waited. A few men shifted in their chairs. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but one of the lawyers leaned toward her and said something quietly. Then Clara stood. The room took her in, some of the men with surprise, some with the careful blankness of people not sure yet what to do with her presence. She didn't start with an argument. She started with the truth. "My name is Clara Hale," she said. "Before that, I was Clara Mercer. My husband Martin died 11 months ago in Harlow County and left debts I didn't know about. And I lost the house and everything in it. And when it was finished, I had a cast iron skillet, a broken trunk, and an advertisement in the Cheyenne paper for a cook's position at a Wyoming ranch." She paused and let the room sit with that for a moment. "That's the true version of how I came to Red Hollow. I'm sure you've heard another one." A few men looked at each other. "I'm not going to ask you to feel sorry for that story," Clara continued. "I'm not telling it to ask for anything. I'm telling it because Mrs. Ashcroft has spent 3 months telling a different version of it, and you deserve to know what you're actually being asked to make a decision based on." She looked across the room, meeting eyes where she could. "She told this territory that I was a woman of questionable character, that my presence at Red Hollow was improper, that whatever was happening out there was a reason to look skeptically at the ranch, at its management, at its future." She paused. "What was actually happening was that I was cooking 3 meals a day, managing accounts, saving winter stores from a flooded root cellar, and sitting across a kitchen table from a man who is one of the most honest people I have ever known, doing the same work you all do, trying to hold something together in hard country." The room was very quiet. "The debt is paid," she said. "The ranch is sound. The water allocation on our eastern boundary has been what it's always been, and there's no legitimate argument that it should change." She looked at Evelyn, briefly, directly. If there are real questions about water rights in this territory, I expect this association can address them based on law and fact. What I'm asking is that you not let a property dispute dressed up as a civic concern be settled here tonight on the basis of stories that were manufactured to serve someone else's business interests. She sat down. The silence lasted longer than was comfortable. Then Henry Crail, from 3 rows back, said in his large voice, "I'll second that the water rights matter be tabled for an independent survey before any association position is taken." 2 men immediately agreed. Fowler looked around the room, looked at Evelyn, and said in the tone of a man grateful for an exit, "Motion to table. All in favor." The majority was not overwhelming, but it was clear. Evelyn Ashcroft said nothing for the rest of the meeting. She sat very still in her chair near the front, and Clara could see the precise quality of her stillness. Not defeat, not exactly, but the recalibration of a woman whose best move had failed, and who was already calculating what came next. It was the first time Clara had seen her look like someone who'd been caught without a prepared response, and the sight of it was not satisfying in the way Clara had expected. It was just true. Afterward, in the cold outside the hall, men came to speak to Gideon, quietly, individually, the way men acknowledge something without making a production of it. Ed Pierce shook his hand. 2 ranchers Clara didn't know by name nodded at her with the specific nod of men who have revised their opinion of something and are acknowledging it without wanting to discuss it. Crail appeared at her elbow. "Good speech," he said gruffly. "Thank you for the second," she said. "Don't make it into something," he said, which was almost word for word what Decker had said to her 2 months ago in the kitchen, and Clara thought there was something particularly Wyoming about that phrase. The way people out here gave you things and then immediately told you not to acknowledge them. Gideon found her when the last conversation had finished. He looked tired in the way of someone who'd been carrying weight for a long time and had just set most of it down. He looked at her with the expression she was learning to read as his version of a great many things he didn't say. "Ready to go home?" he said. "Yes," she said. They walked to the wagon in the cold, the snow from earlier in the week still on the ground, hard packed in the ruts of the road, the stars beginning to come out over the hills. Somewhere behind them, the hall was emptying, men calling to each other in the dark, horses stamping in the cold. Evelyn Ashcroft's carriage pulled out ahead of them on the road and disappeared around the bend, moving fast, moving away. Clara sat beside Gideon on the wagon bench and watched the road ahead and felt, for the first time in months, the particular quality of a situation that has turned. Not ended, not resolved into something clean and certain, but turned. The way weather turns, the way a river shifts after a flood, the way a room changes when the person who's been controlling it finally walks out. There was still work ahead. There would always be work ahead. That was the nature of a place like Red Hollow, a place like this territory, a life like the one she'd chosen. But the worst of it, she thought, the worst of what Evelyn Ashcroft had tried to do to them, had broken against the one thing it hadn't been built to withstand. The truth, told plainly, by a woman who'd stopped being afraid of it. The days after the association meeting had a different quality to them. Not easier exactly, but cleaner, the way air feels after a long rain when the pressure finally breaks and the sky opens up and you can breathe without the weight of what was coming pressing down on your chest. Evelyn Ashcroft did not disappear. Clara hadn't expected her to. A woman who had built that kind of operation over 4 years doesn't dismantle it in a night, because one meeting didn't go her way. In the weeks following, there were 2 more attempts. A letter to the Territorial Land Office questioning the timber sale documentation, and a quiet effort to convince the railroad's regional buyer Prescott to revisit the terms of the North Stand option. Both came to nothing. The timber sale documents were clean because Clara had made them clean. And Prescott, Prescott, whatever his relationship with Evelyn's network, was a businessman first, and the North Stand option was genuinely valuable, and he knew it. By January, the attempts had stopped. Clara noticed their stopping the same way she'd noticed their starting, gradually, then all at once. 1 week there were no new rumors reaching the ranch, then 2 weeks, then a month, and she understood that the architecture Evelyn had spent months constructing had lost its foundation. Without the debt as leverage, without the association as a vehicle, without the social pressure of a territory that believed her version of things, there was nothing left to build on. Evelyn still had her land and her money and her influence. But influence is a thing that depends on people being willing to use it on your behalf, and the men of Garnet Creek and the surrounding territory had, quietly and without announcement, revised their willingness. Gideon heard it from Crail in February, stated with Crail's characteristic bluntness. Evelyn's pulling back. Word is she's looking at land in the southern part of the territory. Different water, different neighbors. Good, Gideon said. Thought you'd want to know, Crail said. And that was the end of it. Clara, when Gideon told her that evening, sat with it for a moment. She'd expected to feel more than she did. More relief, maybe, or more satisfaction. What she actually felt was something quieter. Not anticlimax exactly, but the specific feeling of a threat that has been so thoroughly prepared against that when it finally retreats, it leaves less residue than you'd expected. She'd spent so much of the last 3 months building walls that the absence of what was trying to get through them felt almost like a gap in the daily work. She'll find somewhere else to do it, Clara said. To someone else. Probably, Gideon said. That bothers me. He looked at her. I know, but you can't fight every fight. No. She looked at the fire in the stove. But you can do your piece of it well enough that the next person has a better chance. She paused. I think that's all any of us can do. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That's either very wise or very resigned, he said. I think it's both, Clara said, and he almost smiled. The rebuilding of Red Hollow Ranch that winter and into spring was not a dramatic thing. It was slow and physical and full of the minor frustrations and setbacks of any real work. A fence section that needed to be redone twice because the first post setting was wrong. A section of the barn roof that had looked sound in the autumn and turned out not to be, 3 weeks in March when the weather refused to cooperate and everything ran behind schedule and everyone was irritable about it. Real things take real time, and Clara had made her peace with that particular truth a long time ago. What changed was less visible than fence posts and barn roofs. It was in the texture of daily life at the ranch, in the way the hands moved through the kitchen now without the tentative quality of men unsure of their welcome, in the way Decker had taken to checking in with Clara about supply needs without being asked, in the way Tomas had quietly become the person who baked the cornbread on the mornings Clara was occupied elsewhere, producing it without ceremony and leaving it on the board as if it had always been his job. It was in the way Mrs. Fitch in Garnet Creek had begun introducing Clara to people not as Gideon Hale's new cook, but as Clara Hale, who manages things up at Red Hollow. A small shift in language that carried a weight of social acknowledgement that the territory understood even when it didn't say so directly. It was in the way Gideon talked to her, not dramatically differently. He was still a man of few words. He still defaulted to silence where other men would have filled the space. But the words he used now were different in their assumption. He talked to her as someone who was part of the decisions, not someone who was being informed of them. He'd started keeping the tally books at the kitchen table in the evenings instead of in his office, which meant the work happened in a shared space where she could see it and engage with it or not. And after the first few weeks of this, she'd started offering observations without waiting to be asked, and he'd started expecting them without making a thing of it. This was, Clara had decided, what a real partnership looked like. Not a performance of partnership, not the version where someone makes a show of consulting someone else while having already decided, but the actual daily negotiation of two people who are both genuinely in a thing together. It was imperfect. They disagreed about the timing of the spring slaughter, about whether to take on a new hand Decker had recommended, about whether the south pasture was ready for grazing or needed another month. They disagreed without much drama, and usually arrived somewhere neither of them had started, which Clara thought was probably the mark of an argument worth having. She'd been afraid, in the early weeks after the marriage, of what the arrangement would feel like when the emergency was over. It was easy to be necessary in a crisis. The question was what you were to each other when the crisis resolved, and you were just two people in a house with a shared last name and the everyday weight of a working ranch between you. The answer turned out to be something she hadn't had before. Not romance in the storybook sense. There were no grand declarations, no moments of swept-off-feet certainty. What there was instead was something she'd come to value more than she'd expected. Being known. Being known by a person who had watched her work under genuine pressure and had seen her at her worst strategically and her best practically, and had decided, without ceremony, that she was someone worth being beside. She thought about this on a morning in late April when she was in the kitchen before anyone else was up. The familiar ritual of early coffee and the stove heating up, the light coming in gray through the east window. She thought about the woman who had walked 3 miles down a dirt road with a broken trunk, already half decided that this would be another place that didn't work out. And she thought about what it meant that this was the place, this particular cold, hard, unyielding piece of Wyoming, where something had finally taken root. The feeling was not triumphant. She'd learned to distrust triumph, which always announced itself too soon and left you unprepared for what came after. What she felt instead was the quieter thing, the satisfaction of a person who has put in the work and is standing in the result and recognizing it as real. Ed Pierce came to the ranch in May with a proposal. He arrived on a Saturday morning, declined coffee with the awkward manner of a man who had something to say and didn't want to be delayed in saying it, and told Gideon that a group of the smaller ranchers in the territory, 7 of them, all operating on margins similar to Red Hollow's, had been talking about forming a cooperative purchasing arrangement for winter feed and supplies. The idea was simple: bulk orders, shared transport costs, better negotiating position with the suppliers in Dunbar. Pierce had been thinking about it for a while, and after the association meeting in December, he'd started actually talking to people about it. "We need someone to run the accounts," he said. He was looking at Gideon, but Clara noticed the way his eyes moved once to her and away. Someone who can keep track of what each ranch owes and what's been spent and make sure the whole thing doesn't become a source of arguments. Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked at Pierce. "Who's the 7th rancher?" Pierce blinked. "The Hollis family, east of Caldwell Creek." "Their credit is good?" "Far as I know." "I'd want to confirm that before we include them," Clara said. "Not an insult, just practical. A cooperative works on trust, and it works on everyone being actually able to pay what they owe. One rancher who can't keep up drags the whole arrangement." She paused. "If the accounts are going to be managed properly, they need to be set up properly from the start." Pierce looked at her with the expression of a man who had come to offer a small thing and was discovering it was a larger conversation than he'd anticipated. "You'd be willing to take it on?" "If it's done right," Clara said. Gideon said nothing, which was his way of saying yes to something she'd decided. The cooperative was formalized by June. 7 ranches, a shared purchasing agreement, a simple set of accounts that Clara set up and maintained, and a quarterly meeting at which the books were reviewed by anyone who wanted to review them. It was not complicated, but it worked, and it worked because it had been structured honestly from the beginning, with clear terms that everyone had agreed to before the first order was placed. By the second winter, the 7 ranches had saved enough collectively on feed costs to matter. Not a fortune, but real money in margins where real money was hard to find. By the 3rd year, 3 more ranches had asked to join, and Clara had to expand the account structure to accommodate them. This was how her name became something in the territory that had nothing to do with rumors or scandal or a widow arriving with a broken trunk. It became, instead, the name of the person who ran the accounts and kept them clean and called out discrepancies before they became problems, and treated every rancher in the cooperative with the same directness regardless of their size or standing. It was not a glamorous reputation, but it was a real one, built from work and consistency and the kind of reliability that people notice precisely because it never asks to be noticed. Decker left the ranch in the autumn of the 2nd year. Not under bad circumstances, but because he'd been offered a foreman position on a larger spread south, which was the kind of opportunity that only comes once, and which Clara told him directly he'd be foolish to pass up. He seemed surprised she said it, and then seemed surprised that he was surprised, which she thought was progress of a kind. He shook her hand when he left, not with the exaggerated indifference he'd applied to every interaction in the early months, but with the plain, firm handshake of a man who respects the person he's shaking hands with and wants that to be clear. "You were harder to rattle than I expected," he said. "You were better than you wanted anyone to know," she said. He looked briefly like he might argue with that, then apparently decided against it. He got on his horse and rode out, and Clara watched him go from the kitchen doorway and felt the particular bittersweet quality of watching someone leave a place that made them better and take that improvement with them somewhere new. Tomas stayed. Tomas, who had come into the kitchen on his first silent afternoon asking quietly about cornbread, had by the end of the second year become something between a senior hand and a fixture, the kind of person a place builds itself around without anyone deciding to make it happen. He was still not a man of many words, but his words were better chosen than they'd been, and he'd developed under some combination of Clara's patience and Stubbs's steady example into someone the newer hands looked to for guidance without quite knowing why. Stubbs himself retired from active ranch work partway through the third year. His knees had been telling him for 2 years that the cold and the saddle were no longer a reasonable combination, and he finally listened. He didn't go far. He settled in Garnet Creek in a small house near the edge of town and still came out to the ranch for meals twice a week, which nobody had asked for and nobody discouraged, because some presences become structural. Clara's daughter was born in the third spring. They named her Ruth, which had been Clara's mother's name and which Gideon had agreed to without much deliberation, in the way he agreed to things that were clearly right. She was born in the main house with a midwife from Garnet Creek, and Gideon in the hallway doing a poor job of not pacing, which Clara could hear through the door, and which she found, in the specific delirium of labor, both irritating and deeply reassuring. Ruth arrived in the world loud and opinionated, which Clara thought was appropriate given the circumstances of her parents. She had Gideon's dark eyes and her mother's tendency to watch a room before deciding what to do with it. And from the first weeks it was clear she intended to be in the middle of everything that was happening, regardless of whether the adults thought that was suitable. Holding her daughter that first night, in the bedroom of the house she'd arrived at with a broken trunk and no certainty of anything, Clara felt the full weight of the distance between that morning and this one. It was not a comfortable feeling, exactly. Too large for comfort. It was more like standing at the edge of something vast and being required to take the full measure of it. She thought about what she would want Ruth to know someday, when Ruth was old enough for it. Not the fairy tale version, not the story where the woman arrives and everything resolves because she was good enough and brave enough, and the ending was always waiting for her to find it. That version was a lie, and she'd stopped telling herself lies a long time ago. The real version was messier and more useful, that she had been afraid most of the time and had done things anyway. That she had arrived with nothing and built what she had from work and stubbornness and the willingness to stay in difficult places long enough for them to become familiar. That the people who had tried to diminish her had, without intending to, done her the service of requiring her to become someone who could not be diminished. That belonging is not something a place gives you. It's something you make, slowly, imperfectly, with your own hands, over a long stretch of ordinary days. That was the truth she wanted to give her daughter. Not comfort, exactly, but something more durable than comfort. Gideon came in at some point in the small hours, when the midwife had gone and the house was quiet, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Ruth with the expression of a man who has been confronted with something he has no prior experience of and is trying to determine how to be adequate to it. He reached out one hand carefully, and Ruth's fingers wrapped around one of his without much deliberation. He looked at Clara. Something in his face was undone in a way she hadn't seen before. Not broken, but open. The specific openness of a person who has let something in that they'd kept out for a long time. "She's all right," he said. "She's perfect," Clara said. Then she thought about it. "She's healthy. She's going to be difficult." He looked at Ruth again. "She'll fit in fine here then," he said. Clara laughed. A real laugh. Unguarded. The kind that comes out when something catches you off balance in exactly the right way. Gideon looked pleased with himself in the restrained manner of a man who has made someone he loves laugh and considers it a genuine achievement. Jet up. The sign went up in the summer of the 4th year. It had been Gideon's idea, which surprised her when he mentioned it, and then didn't surprise her at all when she thought about it, because Gideon was a man who marked important things without making speeches about them. He'd had the ranch gate rebuilt that spring. The old one had been patched and repatched until the repairs outnumbered the original wood, and when the new one went in, there was a plank across the top with the ranch name in cut letters, and below the name, in the same cut letters, G and C, Hale. She'd seen it when she came back from a supply run to Garnet Creek, driving the wagon up the road with Ruth asleep against her side, and she'd stopped the wagon at the gate and sat looking at it for a moment. It was a plank of wood with letters on it. It was not a monument or a declaration. It was a practical thing, a gate sign. The kind every ranch in the territory had, stating who the place belonged to. But it stated who this place belonged to, and her name was on it, and she sat there in the wagon with her daughter asleep beside her, and the Wyoming hills going amber in the late afternoon sun, and she let herself feel the full weight of what those two initials meant. She had been nobody in this territory once. She had been a story that other people told about her. A cautionary tale, a subject of whispered commentary, a woman who didn't belong. She had been the sum of her losses, the house, the money, the husband, the standing, the life she'd thought she was building, and that had turned out to be built on someone else's decisions about what she was worth. None of that had been the end of her. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't been sure of when she'd walked down that dirt road with the broken trunk. That it wasn't the end, that the story being told about you is not the story you're living, and the people doing the telling don't get to decide how it finishes. You do. You decide every morning by staying or going, by working or giving up, by being honest or being careful. You decide in the small daily choices that don't feel like decisions at the time, but that accumulate into a life. She had stayed. She had worked. She had told the truth in a room full of men who'd heard something else, and she had let the truth do what truth does when it's given enough room. It had settled, slowly and without drama, into the ground of people's understanding, and it had grown. This was the ranch she had helped build. These were the people she had built it with. This was the daughter sleeping against her arm who would grow up in a place where her mother's name was cut into the wood at the gate. Clara flicked the reins and drove the wagon through. That evening, after supper, after Ruth had been put to bed with more negotiation than a child of 14 months should have been capable of, Clara stood at the kitchen window in the dark and looked out at the yard. The gate was visible from here if you knew where to look. Just the outline of it in the darkness, the shape of the new wood against the familiar hills. Gideon came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was his way, and she didn't say anything either, which had become her way when she was with him. After a while, he said, "Crail told me today that 3 of the association men asked him separately who should chair the water rights subcommittee. All 3 of them mentioned you." Clara looked at the window. "What did you say?" "I said I'd ask you. I'll think about it." "You'll say yes," he said. Not a command, just the observation of a man who knew the person he was talking to. She almost argued with it, and then recognized he was right. "I'll say yes," she agreed. He was quiet a moment. "You know, when you knocked on that door in September, and I looked at you and thought I'd made a mistake hiring someone I'd never met?" "I know," Clara said. "I was wrong about that." "I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "You could let me finish." "You were wrong," she said. "You knew it within the first week. You're not a man who takes long to revise an opinion when the evidence is clear." She looked at him. "And I knocked on that door hoping you'd be someone I could work for without being made to feel like I was a problem to be tolerated. You weren't. That was the first right thing." He turned to face her more fully. "What was the second?" She thought about it honestly. "The day you went back to Garnet Creek and told Henry Crail to his face that what he was repeating was a lie," she said. "You didn't tell me you were going to do it. You didn't do it to be thanked. You just did it because it was the right thing." She paused. "That was when I started thinking this might be something more than a job." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was feeling something he didn't have a practice language for. "I'm not an easy man," he said. "No," she agreed, "and I'm not a comfortable woman. We suit each other." Something settled in his face, the particular settling of a man who has been accepted for what he actually is and knows it. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what it always did, cold, deep, enormous, indifferent to the small lights in the windows of the houses below it. The stars were out, the kind of sky that makes a person feel very small and, depending on who you are, either frightened or strangely at peace with the smallness. Clara had spent a long time being frightened of it. She wasn't anymore. She had learned, not quickly and not without cost, that the size of what's outside you isn't the measure of what's possible inside a life. That belonging doesn't mean the world arranges itself around you. It means you find the right piece of it and put your hands into it and stay long enough to become part of its shape. She had found her piece. It was a cold ranch in Wyoming with imperfect fences and a kitchen that ran hot on the left side of the stove, and a man who didn't say things he didn't mean, and a daughter who was going to be an enormous amount of work. and people around her who had started as strangers and become, without anyone deciding it officially, something like a family. It was not the life she'd planned. It was better than the life she'd planned, because it was the life she'd built with her own hands, out of the actual material of who she was, and it had held. She had arrived with a broken trunk and an old cast-iron skillet, and she had turned out to be enough. That, she thought, was the only story worth telling, not the one where you're rescued, not the one where everything works out because you were good enough or lucky enough, or because the world finally saw your worth and rewarded it, but the one where you decide, in the face of all the evidence against you, that you're not finished yet. Where you stay in the hard place long enough for it to become yours. Where you build something real, imperfect, and enduring from everything they said you didn't have. That was the story. The gate at the end of the road had her name on it. She had earned every letter.